Good day to everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar in which we will dive into a very specific topic that is growing in attention and awareness across the globe, namely the topic around the aspect of governance of artificial intelligence. Now, as adoption of artificial intelligence increases, so will also the need to manage the impact and usage of artificial intelligence and, for that matter of fact, data ecosystems that sustain the AI models. And so in this presentation, I'm going to cover first what is actually artificial intelligence governance. And this becomes more and more important, as we will see, because artificial intelligence is increasing in usage across organizations. It's also becoming more and more important, both in terms of legislation across the globe, as governments start to get involved in artificial intelligence, both for political, competitive, and for that matter of fact, also economic reasons. We will discuss who in the executive team needs to be involved with artificial intelligence. And that's an important topic because AI is not just something that is destined to be important for the IT organization. It's a business tool. It's a tool that will allow the organization to grow and therefore is important for all leaders, all executives in the organization. I'll cover what an AI governance charter is and how you should implement a KPI or a metrics framework for measuring the impact of your governance charter concerning artificial intelligence. And then I'll cover some practical next steps. What do you actually do first? Which is important to get started, mainly because this is a very new topic for all of us. So, AI governance. What is artificial intelligence governance? Well, first, the word governance, obviously the English word governance, but also translated, obviously, the Japanese word, has been around for some time. It's been embedded inside standard business vocabulary, but it's used for slightly different things, and also has somewhat slightly different meanings. Generally, governance is about governing processes. It is the way and rules or actions that we structure, maintain, and also allow for regulating aspects of what we do, even assigning accountability. Now, AI governance is really about what we do as an organization with regards to aspects such as explainability, transparency, accountability, and then ethics. AI governance is really about artificial intelligence being something that we can explain, that it is something that we can see and feel, that it isn't a black box, and that it is ethical in nature. However, those words mean different things for different organizations. They mean different things across the globe. And as a result, there is actually different definitions of AI governance and different descriptions of AI governance. For example, there is a difference between the technical and the policy, or should we call it the legal definition of the word transparency. The technical definition of transparency may include details on the software code or the individual data components, whereas those things might not be included as part of a legal definition of transparency. And so AI governance is still work in progress. even the words explainability and transparency mean different things. Again, whether or not it's a technical description or a legal description. They may include different definitions, for example, of how to measure cost or value or other aspects. So as you, as an organization, start on the path of defining what your AI governance charter is, first have a discussion around what is actually AI governance and what do you as an organization believe that it is, and establish this as part of both your governance charter, but also, as we will talk about later, how you communicate across your organization and outside your organization about what you are doing with regards to artificial intelligence. But first, let's look at how is adoption in artificial intelligence increasing. Now, as you can see from this data, which stems from Gartner's Global CIO Survey, and for more details, obviously, you can go to Gartner for the details around this. But what you're seeing here is an obvious increase in the deployment of artificial intelligence across organizations just over a 3-year period from 2018 to 2020. There is still a substantial number of organizations that have not deployed artificial intelligence, and even for those that have, there are differences in terms of how you would determine deployment, because you can talk about, first, obviously, the number of organizations as you see here, but you can also then talk about within an organization how many AI models have been deployed. So if you look at the approximately 20% of organizations that have deployed AI now in 2020, many of them are still at a pilot phase. And within that, many of them have deployed less than 5 models. So the proliferation is not substantial. Furthermore, the proliferation tends to be within a particular part of the organization, not necessarily something that is within multiple departments. In order for AI governance to become important for the organization, obviously we need more and more models to be established, and we need more and more departments within an organization to use artificial intelligence. Now, the early adopters of AI are typically characterized by organizations where you have a substantial support from the executive team, in fact, support from the CEO. The organization tend to be digitally mature, meaning adoption happens mainly initially in technology companies and banks and in organizations that have a high proliferation of digital maturity. Thirdly, it is organizations that tend to be first actually focused on growth and then on cost, because the AI models tend to be generally first deployed around supporting growth of the business, and then secondly, obviously, to manage the cost of the business. And then often you start to see in mature early adopters that the AI technology and models are deployed within, should we say, the core processes of the business. Now, the barriers to adoption tend to be then the flip side of this. It tends to be lack of executive support. It tends to be a cultural and lack of employee support in the organization. It tends to be concerns about AI governance and a number of other factors that in fact drive this. But you will see in many organizations that these factors tend to be eliminated slowly as the organization deploys this. However, for all organizations, it is important to assume that AI is a critical pillar of the organization, that there is no such thing as an AI strategy, but that AI will be embedded inside the overall strategy of the business. And so this is our starting point. AI is increasing in adoption, And so then now let's look at the next aspect of this, which is then the proliferation of academic research, as well as government sponsored research around artificial intelligence. And I'm going to show you some work from the Berkham-Klein Center at Harvard University in the United States that have done an excellent job of categorizing government, business, and nonprofit organizations' documents that cover AI governance. And this has first led to this excellent time series. And the main message in this is really that from the middle of 2018, we have seen a substantial increase in the number of papers covering AI governance, and also the number of governments and government institutions that have deployed and communicated their strategy around what AI governance is, either for the country or, for that matter of fact, for the nonprofit organization. This is leading to a different kind of adoption curve of AI governance than what we see of, shall we say, traditional technologies or certain other business initiatives. The adoption of AI governance really starts with the coverage from governments and legal institutions around how the government or the legal frameworks for artificial intelligence and governance of that need to be established. We have seen this fairly well developed, for example, in the European Union with its latest AI policy documents that came out in the beginning of 2020 that equally also established an investment framework for the European Union that included actually investment in artificial intelligence governance and how you establish that across the nations that are part of the European Union. The next part of adoption is really increased activity from audit firms and from consulting organizations that tend to be involved in the actual monitoring of business processes as well as governance in the organization. And we are starting to see a substantial uptick in the adoption of governance and AI governance in these organizations as the sort of second wave of artificial intelligence governance. The third wave is that we are starting to see an emerging set of software vendors, artificial intelligence platform providers that are embedding AI governance inside their software platforms as a way of companies automating the governance, or at least certain aspects of the governance of artificial intelligence. And then lastly, of course, we do now see organizations, in particular larger organizations and artificial intelligence mature organizations, adopt frameworks themselves for the business or even for government institutions in terms of setting up their own AI governance charter. My expectation is that by the end of 2022, more than 20% of organizations across the large countries around the world will have an initial AI governance charter in place. So I believe it becomes important for every organization to start to now investigate and understand what AI governance really is. Now, the Berkman Center also did what I think is, at least graphically, a beautiful way of illustrating the coverage and segmenting the coverage of all of these different reports that they looked at into a set of different categories. There are 8 categories in these different reports. And each of these categories are, in my mind, very important to consider as part of your organization's AI governance charter. The 8 categories are: first, privacy, the category of privacy. How does governments deal with privacy? And as you are well aware, privacy is defined differently across the globe. But many of these documents are very specific about how you treat privacy from an AI perspective. The second important aspect is accountability. Who is responsible, and how do you measure that responsibility? How do you ensure that only the right people are involved with both establishing the artificial intelligence models and frameworks, but equally also making decisions about what they do and how they evolve over time? The third is safety and security. How do you define the secure environments? Who has access to the models? Who can change the data set? Who has access to the systems that deploy the decisions around artificial intelligence? Third is the transparency and explainability. Is the model transparent? Can you explain the outcomes of the model, both from a technical perspective and also the decisions taken? Fifth is fairness and non-discrimination, which has been a significant focus, both in terms of describing the negative aspects of artificial intelligence, but frankly also the positive opportunities of addressing these topics now finally using technology. Fairness and non-discrimination is obviously about the fact that many data sets initially have bias built into the data set. And how do we address that in our AI charter? How do we communicate externally that we are dealing with bias and address bias when it comes up? And we'll talk about that later. Then, of course, the human control of the technology. Can we, as humans, opt out of using the AI models? Or the professional then responsibility? So who is responsible for what? And last, the eighth aspect is, how do you promote the human values of AI governance inside your charter? Now, each of these 8 points that if you can blow up the slide here, you can actually see the details of, are incredibly important when you establish your AI governance charter. And we'll talk about some of the specifics of this as we get into the next couple of slides. The main thing in this, which is very important to mention here and now, is that this establishes the why. Why do we need to create an AI governance charter in our organization? And the answer is very, very simple. We need to do this because AI will become pervasive across everything you do. It therefore affects your employees, it affects your customers, it affects your suppliers, it affects your leadership team, it impacts what your brand stands for, and therefore this goes far beyond what normal technology has done over the past 40 to 50 years. It essentially impacts the core nature of what your business is. And therefore, you must establish your position on these 8 aspects, and therefore start to consider what is, therefore, your AI governance charter. Once you've established why are we doing this and what it is, then we have the question of who needs to be involved. And it is very clear that an artificial governance charter involves many people and many executives in your organization. First and foremost, starting with your CEO. The CEO is responsible for the AI governance charter and also then for assigning organizational accountability. The second person, or in essence, body in the organization, is the external board of the company, the supervisory board of the company. The supervisory board is responsible for strategy and is responsible essentially for the execution that is then handed over to the executive team. The board therefore needs to be involved in the definition of the strategy around artificial intelligence and the establishment of the charter that then becomes the responsibility of the CEO. But there are other people that need to be involved in this as well. And so there's some specific functional roles in the business that are important to include as part of this. The first would be to include the chief legal counsel, here called CLC. The chief legal counsel is responsible for the AI legal and risk factors for the organization. AI is not a technology. It is embedded inside technology, but it has very much to do with the legal aspects and the risk aspects of the organization. And that falls squarely within the responsibility of the chief legal counsel. Third person as part of the executive team is the CFO. The CFO is definitely responsible for AI cost, but also the financial risk, because AI embodies a degree of risk that is not just a legal risk, it is also a financial risk to the business that needs to be understood by the CFO. The fourth person in the executive team is the chief human resource officer, so the person responsibility for the employees, the personnel in the organization, because it becomes very important to appreciate that AI changes how work is done in the company. And as a result, the chief human resource officer is responsible for the creation of the AI employee policy and charter, often something that sits as part of the overall AI governance charter for the organization. Now, these four individuals are critical, but there will be others. There will be a number of different business leaders that need to be part of this. First, the CMO, assuming the CMO is responsible for both the brand and what the customer sees as part of the experience of engaging with the organization. And therefore, the CMO is responsible essentially for the AI customer and brand charters. Again, building blocks of the overall AI governance charter. And then last but not least, the proliferation of artificial intelligence and the need for governing artificial intelligence may in fact now provide the last impetus for every organization to consider establishing the role of chief data officer, CDO, chief data officer, a person responsible for the evolution of the AI governance charter on a daily basis, as well as also responsible for the governance of data overall, and even perhaps monetization of data and the usage of that data within the organization. If not the chief data officer, then at least someone like, for example, the chief digital officer or the CIO within the organization. It becomes important that the technical aspects of this, as well as the business aspects, the corporate monetization and usage of artificial intelligence from a daily basis, is entrusted from a coordination perspective with someone. Now, let's keep in mind, artificial intelligence in of itself and the knowledge of how to use that from a business perspective very rapidly is becoming the responsibility of every manager in an organization. And therefore, these executives are responsible for ensuring that the charter is in place. But every manager is responsible for understanding that the new emerging leadership skills for all managers include an understanding of how artificial intelligence is a leadership skill, and therefore how the establishment of artificial intelligence governance is part of every leader's responsibility. So this becomes an important aspect of understanding not just what the governance charter is and what artificial intelligence is, or why we have to establish this, but who is responsible, and thereby understanding that there are many executives involved in this as we move forward in the world that we're in. Now, then let's start to get more practical, because now you have to implement your AI charter. So what is it actually that you need to implement? And I want to cover briefly 6 main aspects that I believe you must consider within your AI charter. Now, whether you adopt them is obviously your determination, but each of these 6 are, in my mind, incredibly important, and discussing them is important because this is about trust in your brand, your product, your organization, and your leadership team. And so when we start to look at artificial intelligence and therefore the governance of it, we first need to determine who needs to know about this. For example, does your customers need to know that you are using artificial intelligence, whether it is in your product, in the servicing of your customer, in the online experience that they have with you, in your sales tools? So the right to know is an important thing for you to determine as an organization. The second thing is, even if you have told them that you use it, you may not necessarily tell them when they are using it. So you need to determine, should your customers or your employees be notified when a decision is taken that is based on using an artificial intelligence algorithm? And so notification of AI decisions, so not only that you use it, but also that a decision has been made using artificial intelligence, is something you need to be considerate of within your AI governance charter. Now, people may be able to know that the decision is taken using AI, but should they be allowed to review the decision before it becomes executed? That might be important for your employees because they may have a knowledge that would be good to incorporate as part of the decision, well understanding that our data sets are not fully built out yet. So should you allow for review of the decision, which then leads to the next and fourth question: should people be allowed to opt out of the systems that use it if they don't like either the fact that AI is being used or they don't like the decision? Fifth could be that we need to consider whether or not we should notify on the basis of the fact that there could be bias in the data. So people, you may want to say to your customers or your employees or your suppliers, look, this data set isn't perfect. There is actually a potential element of bias in the data because we don't have data, for example, on certain age groups or certain suppliers and their data set isn't incorporated, or the car hasn't run through a certain set of scenarios that mean that the autonomous driving system isn't actually able to respond to certain situations. And then the last and sixth point here is, should there be a remedy for misuse? Meaning, should you compensate your clients if there is somebody in your organization that misuse the AI systems deliberately, or that decisions are taken using biased data? You need to consider all of these 6 points. They could or could not be incorporated as part of the charter that you establish around AI governance. But the main aspect here is you have to take a position, because not having had the discussion could have a negative impact on your brand, on your customers, on your suppliers, or for that matter, your employees. Now, as you get to this, you will see the details of what I've talked about here. So I don't need to show you the details, but it is important that you actually go through this and really consider the aspects of what I've just talked about. Once you've done that, you're ready to establish the governance charter. Take the items, the 8 items from Harvard University, some of the points I've mentioned, and now you can start to frame out your position of a governance charter. And there will be a holistic structure for it, for your organization. And then there may be pillars that cover your customers, your employees, and your suppliers. For your customers, for example, you may need a clear public statement about how your organization uses artificial intelligence in customer situations, or options that they have to opt out or review decisions or misuse. This customer charter may in fact be supported by a dashboard, a visualization of how you are dealing with things. And some of this dashboard may be made public to your customers. Second is employees. Now, the employees need to understand what is your philosophy, what is the ethical aspect of artificial intelligence, and what is your usage, what is your intended ways of embedding this in processes, what is the right of employees in the work environment regarding artificial intelligence. This is very critical for the HR organization to start to consider it and take a lead on. And then third is your suppliers. Artificial intelligence is being embedded in the end-to-end value chain that you have. And so you may need to inform your suppliers. Your data sets are not well integrated yet in most supply chain organizations. And therefore, you may have bias in your data. How do you deal with this? Within the supply chain, obviously, the product development organization, the manufacturing organization needs to consider how it is using artificial intelligence. So the supply chain leadership team needs to really craft a supply chain or a supplier AI policy that is part of your overall AI charter. Once you've then established the charter, we then get to how you measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't impact it. And so there are a number of different metrics that you need to put in place, because ultimately that will then allow you to incorporate this in software tools, allow it actually to be electronically structured. I would suggest at least considering 7 different aspects of KPIs, some of which could be embedded in the other. First is obviously the data. You need measures from where does the data come from? What is the lineage of the data, the history of the data, the quality of the data? There could be metrics around that. The security, who has accessed the models? Who are allowed to use the models? Can you get alerts in terms of improper usage or tampering of things, both data and the model, or for that matter of fact, who accesses it? Cost and value. This is about measuring the cost and the value of the data, which would be the ideal state of an artificial intelligence governance charter. Bias, metrics that show bias, that approximate, therefore, information on ethics. How ethical is your AI environments? Accountability, showing who can be involved, who has been involved, so that you can then have an audit trail that can measure the impact, which is then the last aspect, which is both audit and time, could be embedded inside the 5 others. Audit because we need to track things periodically. Audit because this eventually will become the responsibility of the board, and therefore you need to likely potentially even report on it externally. And then of course time is a measure in of itself, is how are you improving some of these metrics over time. So think about not just a charter, but how you establish a KPI or metric framework for your governance environment. And then this leads me then to my last slide, which is what are the actions you need to take now? And so I would suggest that there are 6 actions that you take immediately. First is you need to determine the executive responsibility. The CEO of the organization needs to start to get involved. There needs to be a plan for accountability, who is responsible for what, and that should include the IT function. You need to start to create your version 1 of an AI governance charter. This will change over time, but version 1 is important to start now. You need to then, once you've done that, create your version 1 of measurable KPIs. How are you going to track how well you do? And then once you've done that, you can start to think and investigate some of the software platforms that are out there that actually allow you to establish the templates and the structures for this automatically, because some of this already exists. And then 5th is once you have this in place, you need to do both point number 5 and point number 6. Number 5, you need to establish a communication plan. You very soon need to tell your customers what you're doing. You very soon need to tell your employees what you're doing with artificial intelligence. So start thinking about who is responsible for the communication plan, how you get the entire organization involved, and how you continuously communicate about the changes that you make. And then the last part of this is start to think about building an education and development plan for the entire organization, but perhaps initially for the leaders and managers that need to be involved in this. Artificial intelligence is really also not just a technical aspect, it is also a new leadership skill. Keep in mind, many managers will be managing not only people, but also AI, robots, and models as part of their business. And so they need the knowledge of how to do this, and that should be part of your artificial intelligence governance charter. With that, thank you, and we can now continue.